All right, joining me now on the Matthew Filipowicz show is Beau Hodai. Beau is a freelance journalist, and he's the publisher of DBA Press, which is at dbapress.com, as well as a reporter for In These Times magazine, which you can find at inthes.times.com. Beau, thanks so much for being on the show, man.
Oh, thanks for having me, Matt.
All right, so Beau, you recently wrote an amazing piece for In These Times and also for DBA Press on the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. For those who haven't heard about ALEC, they really should know about them because their reach is insane. Give us an overview. So what exactly is ALEC, and what exactly do they do?
Well, ALEC is, what it bills itself as is the nation's largest public-private legislative partnership. And what they do is, or how it's comprised is it has about 2,000 member lawmakers from state legislatures nationwide. The bulk of them, by and large, are Republican lawmakers. And now, that's the public sector part of their operation. The private sector part of their operation is about, and this is based on what limited information ALEC will disclose, is about 250 member corporations, special interest organizations, and think tanks. And what they do is they have 9 task forces that address various governmental issues, and they sit down, public and private sectors, and come up with model legislation. Oftentimes you'll see that the legislation is introduced by representatives of the private sector, and it can go the other way. Public sector members may introduce it as well. Then it's approved by both the public and private sector, and it's passed on to ALEC's member lawmakers, the 2,000 lawmakers we just discussed, and they take whatever pieces of model legislation they want back to their home assemblies, work to get it passed into law, and then we as their constituents must deal with the consequences.
Right. So it's essentially an alliance between corporations, lobbyists, and politicians. The corporations and lobbyists craft this legislation, and pretty much they package these bundles of legislation, which they pretty much give to politicians to pretty much, for the most part, oftentimes word for word will introduce this legislation.
Yeah, they do, and it is important in fairness to note that lawmakers do also introduce, so-called model legislation. But at the end of the day, the question is still who wrote it, because, if you look at the laws that lawmakers come up with, I think it's fair to say 9 times out of 10 they're not actually written by the lawmaker, but rather are written by some lobbyist. So God knows what lawmakers actually do other than serve as a gateway for, these corporate-backed pieces of legislation.
Right.
And that's I guess the long and short of it.
Okay, so essentially, though, like ALEC's, their main kind of goal is essentially, tell me if I've got this correct, it's essentially to privatize everything, correct? Am I right about that?
Sure, that's basically it in a nutshell.
Yeah,
that's one of their goals. This year, you see that another primary initiative of theirs is also state-level opposition to EPA greenhouse gases emissions laws. Which, of course, is another subject near and dear to the hearts of their corporate membership. And you see, of course, Coke Industries public sector, or Coke Companies public sector, otherwise known as Coke Industries, who's also, of course, involved in several industries that are concerned with emissions law. And then you have ExxonMobil and things like that. And the privatization issue is the one that I would say they probably advanced far above any other this year. And like you were talking about earlier with bundled laws, you see popping up in states in public records request materials, literally a whole bundle of budgetary bills aimed at putting stricter restrictions on the functions of state governmental agencies, and where called for by various other, councils on privatization that are called for by ALEC pieces of model legislation, then, certain goods and services and state agency functions, therefore, then must be privatized. And it applies to everything from Department of Motor Vehicles to the operation of state parks to, I understand some educational services, as well as, of course, the private prison industry has got a huge hand in all this.
The private prison, they're heavily involved with a lot of stuff like down in Arizona, their prison industrial complex down there, correct?
Sure, and it's not just limited to Arizona. Florida is another good state to look at. Florida just recently passed, as part of Governor Rick Scott's budget reform deal. The legislature just passed it, where what they're going to do is they're going to privatize the prisons in all of southern Florida, basically, which I think amounts to a total of 14 more prisons to be privatized in that state, which is pretty much unheard of.